Modern postural yoga really started the whole movement that we see today is all a result of that particular period in history. As we saw in our previous talk that the modern thing was detonated by what Swami Vivekananda said about how people should be treating yoga. So his main emphasis was to really talk about the business of science with Sanskrit. And that was his message to the world. And therefore, as Sanskriti by extension, his speeches across the country detonated the whole movement that we see as a result today. Now, what exactly happened around that time made a difference on what happened later on. So, for example, one of the main center for yoga started by Yogendra. Swami Yogendra and his wife Sita Devi were instrumental in starting that movement around Bombay. And she became the first woman to write a book about yoga in India. At the same time, in Bengal, there was a huge movement of yoga happening in the 1920s. And this started with what has become known as Ghosh's College in 1923. The emphasis was different from what we saw in Bombay. The emphasis was on physical education. As you can see, they had good physique and they were not shying away from using dumbbells and barbells in order to improve their physique as well. And so it would be erroneous to think about various movements in Bengal as just either as physical prowess or as in yoga related activities. For example, here's a picture of Vishnu Charan Ghosh. As you can see, he had muscles to show and he also had yoga moves that are very common today. In fact, this year, 1923, we are celebrating Ghosh's College of Physical Education, its birth centenary. When I say we, I mean that advisedly because I am also a product of the same school. I learned my yoga right at the Ghosh's College way back in the 1960s. Now, on the second part, there was also another development around Bombay area, Bombay, Pune. When I say Bombay, I mean Bombay as in Bombay Presidency. That was started by Jagannath Gune, who became known as Swami Kuvalayānanda. And what he started was also very radical. He started a yoga journal called Yoga Mimamsa. So the aim of the journal was not just to expound all the yoga moves, but also to look at it from a scientific point of view. In fact, he had a range of Westerners coming in and working on them on a scientific basis. One notable one was one guy named Behanan. He did his PhD from Yale University by studying the psychological aspects of yoga at the very heart of the Bombay School. So, as I mentioned, Yoga Mimamsa was the journal that started yoga business as a scientific study. In the initial issue, it expounded on the mechanics, the pure mechanics of yoga, the question of how and why they work, came later. So, for example, in Kuvalayānanda's journal, he specifically stated that Swami Vivekananda and others tried to explain some of its principles in the light of modern sciences. So he acknowledges that, but they never took to experimentation in order to prove their point. And his journal and his studies were precisely to do that, to look at it from a scientific point of view by doing experimentation. Now, the other thing that I want to emphasize is that we sort of think of yoga as something that has been there for 1,000 years or 800 years, if you like. That is not quite so. One good illustration is what is known as Trikonasana, when you do a triangle with your body, either with your arms up or arms sideways. Here is a picture of Swami Sivananda doing that posture in 1931. We do know from historical fact that this picture was taken from 1931. But here's the thing. There was no mention of Trikonasana anywhere in the yoga literature up until that point in time. So clearly, yoga was also nourishing from the Western exercise routines that came along around the same time. Now, I have to mention here Swami Shivananda Saraswati of Umachal Ashram, that's in Assam. And what he did was he also emphasized hormonal yoga that I mentioned in the context of another pioneering lady who started it in the US. But what Swami Shivananda did in 1929, he also started a yoga hospital and college, which was quite new. So his treatment was thoroughly yogic treatment for all kinds of ailments that he treated the patients with. And the other thing that he did was most of his treatments came free. The way I see the difference between the schools of thought, the Bombay Presidency and the Calcutta Presidency or the Bengal Presidency schools, Bombay Presidency schools started as largely a research-oriented thing. They started a journal. They went around doing global studies, whereas in Calcutta, they were emphasizing on improving health and promoting awareness through popular articles, for sure, in and around Calcutta and generally in Bengal. But they also had an unsaid goal that goes back to what Swami Vivekananda was talking about, namely, it was talking about strengthening not just the body, not just the mind, but also country as a whole. And we see that as this movement, the Bengal movement, was intimately connected with what has become known as the Anushilan Samiti, which was at the forefront of violent overthrow of the British from India. And that nourishment of the Anushilan Samiti came from the yoga practices, in particular the Ghosh's College. On the other hand, there was a third group of development taking place, and that was in southern India through T. Krishnamacharya School, and that was sponsored by the King of Mysore. So his emphasis was somewhat different, although he also started a school. First set of students, some of them became very famous. They started their own yoga school. For example, B.K.S. Iyengar and Pattabi Joyce. So Iyengar started his Iyengar Yoga and Joyce started his Ashtanga Yoga. So they became famous in their own right. And the difference, broadly speaking, Iyengar Yoga is you hold your posture for a fairly long period of time, whereas Ashtanga Yoga is flow between postures. So you go from one movement to the other without holding one particular posture for a very long time. Whereas if you go back to Calcutta School, they were doing each posture separately and giving a break in between the two time periods. So those are broadly three different approaches of yoga. Coming back to the Calcutta school, the Calcutta school also started a tour through the initiative of Vishnu Ghosh and Buddha Bose that I mentioned earlier. They took around a road show to all around India. In particular, they went to Mysore school and to the Bombay school and expounded their version of yoga, if you like. So there was a lot of cross-fertilization going on between those schools that we don't quite recognize what the connections are. So one school that arose out of that is one set of fluid motions coming in. The second is sequencing a series of postures. And the third is also a series of posture, not necessarily so much between the postures, but rest between the postures. So if you think about what is the significance of all these three schools, the yoga was, before that, was practiced by sects or specific groups of people in different parts of India in pockets. They were treated more like a secret knowledge format. Whereas what these three schools did was something very, very distinct. They brought out this thing out to the world, to the general population, first in India and then to the rest of the world. In fact, what we see as modern postural yoga today is an outcome of what happened in those years in the 1930s and 40s.